Hello everyone, this is Murat Ozkaleli speaking from ADA University. Hello to everybody from Baku, Azerbaijan. Today I would like to talk about a little bit about certain concepts in the field of international relations, but before going through the kind of an intro class in international relations, I would like to overview an alternative perspective based on etymological method, which digs in to the investigation of certain concepts in comparative, even a dialectical fashion. Now, before I move on to the basics of international relations, I would like to make certain conceptual distinctions to separate the Western perspective on international relations, which is the dominant perspective, of course, and try to juxtapose the Western understanding of international relations to an alternative, but not necessarily non-Western, that at the later parts of the lecture that I'll try to explore a little further and elaborate a little further of why I am trying to refrain from using the word non-Western. But at this point, let's start basically talking about two concepts. The first one is going to be politics, and the second concept is going to be the translation of politics to the Turkic or Azerbaijani language, or many languages that are spoken in the larger Middle Eastern area, from North Africa to the mountains of Afghanistan, where the Muslim majority would live. It is the concept of siyasət. If you ask to a Middle Easterner, to a person from Turkey, from Azerbaijan, from Iran, Persia, from any country in the Arabic-speaking world, and ask what would be the translation of politics into your language, the answer would be siyasət. Yet, British historian Bernard Lewis, whose expertise was on the Middle East, warns us that these two concepts might not be the equivalent of each other, because politics, etymologically speaking, is coming from the source of polis. That's the city-state in ancient Greece. And siyasət is coming from the root word sys. And this is more related to training or grooming horses. Now, why does it matter? Why do you think is that these two concepts that are fundamentally different in their etymological roots, but are being used as translations, and I think that this is one-way translation, but we can say that siyasət is also being translated to the Western languages as politics. Why do we use these two fundamentally different words as equivalents or translations of each other? And what would be the consequences of using these two words? I think that it is posing a fundamental conceptual problem, which leads to certain conceptual or theoretical even challenges as we try to understand the different mentalities of the two separate civilizations that gave birth to these two concepts. Once again, politics is about the welfare of the polis. Siyasət is, roughly speaking, giving the good training, to quote horses unquote, but then later it is, of course, the administrative skills. Now, we can further compare two more words. One would be, it's broken, one would be government, and the other would be hükümet. Once again, if you think that what is the translation of government into Middle Eastern language, Arabic, Farsi, or Turkic language, that would be hükümet. Once again, however, these two words are coming from fundamentally different etymological sources because they are based on dramatically different roots in their experiences. Government is coming from kaiberne or cyberne, that is the rudder of a ship. So it is mostly based on the sea civilization or the experience with the sea or the ocean. Whereas hükümet is once again is coming from an Arabic root word of HKM, and it is not to govern, but in a way it is a rule, but it's a very distinct way. One more example for the etymological method as distinguishing different experiences and concepts would be the comparison of parliament, coming from the French word parler, to speak or to say something, and that would be meclis in Middle Eastern civilizations, which is considered more of the Middle East is considered as a land civilization. I might even add a Russian or Slavic word of Duma. And when we think in terms of, for instance, if I ask what Duma is to my students, the Russian-speaking students here in Azerbaijan, the most common answer would be the lower house of the Russian parliament. Now, what I argue here, however, is that actually Duma is not parliament. Duma is Duma because the root word of Duma, which roughly speaking means contemplation, thinking, deep thinking, or meclis, to sit together in Arabic. These, in their root words, denote for different experience. And unless we understand and appreciate these different root words, that it would be quite difficult to follow how and why they differ. If we just say that meclis or Duma are, like, say, meclis is Azerbaijani or Turkish parliament, or Duma is the Russian parliament, I think that we're missing a really important aspect of conceptualization in global setting. We are just collapsing the root meanings of meclis or Duma, calling them parliament, and actually alienating these concepts to themselves so that we could understand what they would mean in English or in Western languages. So the problem here, the particular problem here that we are going to be facing is that when we translate basic concepts that are related to politics, even the word politics is not all exhaustive or covering the whole entire globe, we're missing a lot of information. If not, we are totally misunderstanding, misconceiving the world as it is outside of the West. I think that this is the starting point for my argument of thinking in terms of international politics, question mark, beyond the Western setting. That this is a crucial component of international politics beyond the Western setting. One more argument before I go back to the Western understanding of international relations, just overviewing it in its general formation and eventually comparing the Western to, and once again I'm having a question mark by calling it non-Western, and I'll explain why it's a problem later on. That would be the wrapping up of my argument. Now, let's go back to the basic idea of the symbol of, or the signifier of the signified authority. What signifies, what symbol signifies the authority in Western versus, let's say, Turkic civilizations? Of course, in the West, if we see a crown that represents the king or the queen, which is the symbol or the signifier of authority. Whereas in Eastern cultures, if you go over the internet and check for the Ottoman sultans until about the late 18th century, or Shah Ismail of Azerbaijan, you would realize that instead of the crown, the old Turkic sultans carried a headgear, what is called kavuk or shroud. What is really interesting about kavuk is that it is indeed the shroud, the white fabric that, according to Muslim faith, that you would be buried with instead of a cascade. The Ottoman rulers, or Shah Ismail as Azerbaijani ruler, was carrying this heavy fabric, artfully folded fabric, as a reminder of memento mori. So that also is giving us a fundamental difference between the two cultures. On the one hand, we have this Western understanding of authority that is practically telling us that this golden ornament, originally coming from perhaps a tiara, a papal tiara would be a good example. That is all these little gems and precious stones, giving the shiny look of it. It is the fancy expression of authority in Western cultures. Whereas, on the other hand, that we have this alternative understanding that, as a memento mori, that the Sultan, no matter how powerful as a person he might be, is immortal, that eventually he's gonna die. And that is like the Roman slaves reminded the triumph general, the Roman general, during the triumph of that, the Rome was bigger than the general himself. The Ottoman sultans were constantly reminded that the God is greater than the Sultan. The God is the greatest, as a matter of fact. So you see that now we have both on the conceptual side and in the experience side, from the phenomenological understanding, we are facing two very different cultures. Yet, as unfortunate as it might be, the international relations as we understand it is an American or Western social science as it was once identified by Stanley Hoffman. Now, next, what I would like to do is that I'm gonna just overview the basic tenets of Western international relations, especially its realist roots, and eventually go back to the point where I started and explain why taking non-Western as an alternative to Western is also very problematic. All right, let's now overview the roots of international relations by discussing political realism and international relations as its roots. Now, to talk about the general background of international relations, I think that the philosophical sources of realism, as it is really well known, go as far as the ancient Greece, and it's being originally expanded as an idea to ancient India and China. If we go through with the realist philosophical background, we came out with philosophers or the thinkers like Sun Tzu, Thucydides, Machiavelli, Hobbes, and Clausewitz. These are more or less considered as the classical realists. So to understand international relations, especially in the Western understanding, if we consider this line as time, and if you realize that this T line that is signifying the time is linear and upwards, and why I am putting it as a linear and as an upward is to emphasize two things. First of all, the Western understanding of political time is linear. It goes from a particular starting point and goes. But also what I like to kind of emphasize or underline is that it is upwards, so it is kind of quote-unquote progressive, that it is the human civilization progresses. It goes better, like as in the developmental theory, that our understanding goes upwards or in a progressive fashion. Now, when we think in terms of time-space nexus, one of the most interesting things is to identify time with the metaphors of space. So that means that we are moving in time as if that we are moving in space from a point A, that's the linear understanding, of course, is that we're moving from point A to point B to point C in a directional way. Now, that also gives us an understanding that there must be a starting point, and that starting point for the Western understanding of international relations is the ancient Greek general named Thucydides. Thucydides was an Athenian general who switched sides due to the fact that he lost a battle and the punishment was a capital punishment, so he was going to be most likely executed, and therefore he switched sides from Athens to the other side, namely Sparta. That gave him a very interesting base, as he was able to observe to warring parties from not only one side but also both sides. That it became possible for him to understand the two different angles of the same war. He ended up writing a magnum opus, which I believe, arguably, I think that still is providing us the dictionary of modern international relations. His book was titled The History of the Peloponnesian War. Peloponnese is Greece, the main part of Greece, and there was this war between Athens and Sparta, and the book introduces us all the major concepts that we are still using, such as maybe balance of power, security dilemma, without really naming it necessarily in such a fashion, but nevertheless it is kind of explaining the content of the issue and so on and so forth. So what Thucydides introduces us is how to think as an IR theorist, how to understand international relations theories. Of course, this is a very rich book. It's a rather lengthy book. But one thing that I like the most about the history of the Peloponnesian War, besides that the fact that it is the kind of the origin of our thinking in international relations, is the fact that it is written, unlike the modern texts, it's written in a dialogue. Now, how does it differ from the modern texts of academic texts of international relations? Well, in international relations, let's say you are reading a main academic text. It is actually an authority speaking to you, lecturing to you in your own voice. In other words, that your voice is hijacked and your thinking is hijacked by the author, and you are getting under the spell or indoctrination of the author that you are reading, and your success as an IR theorist would be measured through the system of examinations and oral examinations and written examination, how much you really comprehended, understood, or internalized the basic tenets and ideas of the author. Thucydides was different. Thucydides was different in such a way that instead of him speaking as the authority, he kind of expressed those who spoke for Athens and Sparta and some other groups of communities in the war, Syracusians and colonies of either Athens or Sparta and so on and so forth. Of course, it's the beginning, and the first few chapters really constitute the basic vocabulary of international relations. But I think that the most influential part of, arguably, the history of the Peloponnesian War is the little dialogue called the Melian dialogue. It is about the Athenian invasion on the island of Milos, and the Melians were Spartans. It was a Spartan colony, yet the Melians were neutral. There was this conversation between the Athenian generals and the elders of the island Milos. Melians were making this very interesting argument, saying that because they were so tiny and neutral and harmless to the great Athenian empire, it would be quite immoral for Athenians to invade the island of Milos. It would be against the morality of this world or the beyond. The Athenian response, I believe, has become the motto of at least realist international relations, is that what Athenians said as a response was that the strong can do, strong does what it can, and weak suffers what it must. Strong do what it can, weak suffer what it must. So what Athenians basically argued, that the reason why the Melians were invoking certain moral vocabulary was because they were weak. And Athenians had to do what they had done. Eventually they devastated Milos, killed all the men and sold all the women and the children in the slave market. Because if they don't do that, didn't do it, they would have looked weak, and that would have provoked further rebellion. So that created a certain dilemma between the understanding of realism that prevails in international relations and the moral argument that is the understanding. So when we think in terms of international relations, the first question is the following: can we apply the human morality to international relations? And the answer to that is that no, we may not really do that. Unfortunately, the main understanding is that it is really difficult. So that kind of brings us to another theorist, namely Niccolo Machiavelli. He lived in the 15th and 16th centuries, 1469 to 1527. He wrote his really famous book, The Prince, in 1513, but not published for about 2 decades, as the book eventually came in 1532. So what Machiavelli really argues is that can we apply human morality to state politics? And he introduces a very interesting concept which is known as virtue. If you realize that virtue is kind of sounding like virtue, but it is fundamentally different. Virtue in Latin meant manliness. So the patriarchic nature of ruling the state for prince is based on virtue. And to understand virtue, which I believe Machiavelli arguably is very much misunderstood or mispresented, I don't know, I'll try to explain and you'll be the judge of it, is that, well, the question is the following: can we be immoral, or should we immoral in running state? If you're a liar, a murderer, as a human being, then it poses a particular problem if you are an individual. But if you are running a state, certain activities that might have been called immoral, identified as immoral, would be a necessity, because the main idea is to sustain the state, and a sustaining state cannot be reduced into individual morality. So now we're facing a dilemma here. If you're to run a state, rule a state, become a ruler of a state, you need to exercise certain activities that might look like not so nice at an individual level. This is exactly what Machiavelli is talking about, virtue. For instance, for Machiavelli, you need to be cruel to run a state. You need to do certain things that would be extremely cruel at an individual level. But there is a limitation in Machiavelli's idea, that is, you need to be using cruelty in a very, very careful way, what he calls the well-used cruelty, meaning that you need to be cruel as much as it is necessary. So you become cruel, and then you need to repeat that again. Usually I explain it to my students in the following way. Imagine that I am so nice of a person, right? I give extra points quite indiscriminately based on individual needs. You know, maybe there's this student who had a crisis, a family crisis, a financial crisis, and so on and so forth. So I kind of gave extra assignments and helped that particular student to improve the grade. And there's this another student, then I adjust. So I'm quite fair and just as an individual. So I'm not inflating the grades, but being nice, quote unquote. What would happen in the next year? Because I would be identified as a nice professor, next year less and less students come to the class well prepared. Instead, they would expect me to be nice to them. In the alternative scenario, let's imagine that I am a terrible professor, which perhaps I am, I guess, with notorious reputation of not giving any extra grades, any extra bonus points under no circumstances. That would create an alternative identity for me, and as the subsequent classes, students come up, they would hear this reputation, the notorious reputation, and guess what? They would be very well prepared. So what Machiavelli says, therefore, is that like this notorious professor, you need to have this really bad reputation, so to speak, not totally, let's say, cruel reputation, right? It's not, Machiavelli doesn't really advise you to be unfair. Machiavelli advises the prince to be cruel enough that would spread fear, which would motivate. And Machiavelli ends up saying that, well, this might not really sound nice, and it is indeed not nice if you are judging it from individual level. But this is the reality of politics. All right. Now, if we consider Thucydides as the beginning point, the point zero for modern understanding of international relations, and as we have discussed, Machiavelli would be a really important stop. The understanding of, at least realist understanding of international relations, then I think that a third person to talk about would be Thomas Hobbes and his book titled Leviathan. Thomas Hobbes experienced something that no human being should have experienced, I guess. That is the Third Year War in general, and maybe I consider it as an extension in a way of the Third Year War to Britain. That is the English Civil War, and if we consider that the Third Year War ended with the Treaty of Westphalia, which is 1648, in 3 years, Hobbes publishes his magnum opus called Leviathan. And really interesting connection here that we need to establish is that actually Thomas Hobbes is the translator of Thucydides. Now, let's try to do two things. First, understand why Hobbes is so important for the modern conceptualization of international relations. Then question what really motivated Thomas Hobbes to write Leviathan. Now, Thomas Hobbes comes out with this really important idea that if there is no state, there prevails anarchy. Now, I would like to stop there for a moment and understand what this anarchy really means. And I think that the best way to understand anarchy is that, of course, if we go to the basic etymological root of anarchy, is that it is arcane, to govern, to rule in ancient rule, that is the source of archy part. And if we put the prefix anarchy, that means absence of archy. So absence of the ruler. To understand this archy, I believe that we can go back with another idea. And I think that this is quite fundamental to understand what Hobbes was really talking about and what it was eventually adopted by the other students of international relations in modern times. That if we consider this, in my poor drawing, a bridge, there was this fictional conversation that was supposed to be happening between Kubilai Khan and Marco Polo. And Kubilai Khan asks Marco Polo, what makes a bridge a bridge? Is it the bricks, little bricks, or it is the arc that keeps the brick together? Because, well, the argument is that without bricks you cannot build a bridge, yet the main idea is that if you just put the bricks in any other shape, there would be no stable bridge. Later on, maybe that is kind of giving the inspiration of what we call as agent structure debate in international relations, but let's leave it to another discussion. Now, this basic shape here, the arc shape, became, I believe, metaphorically speaking, the source of this arcane. So the main idea is that what keeps, if we think these, and like, let me just go back to the front piece of Leviathan. If you realize, if we can reflect it on the screen, you would realize that this was supposed to be King Charles, and holding a sword on one hand and a scepter on another hand. And I think that if you pay close attention to the body of the king, that's the Leviathan, the body of the king is made of little human beings. So these are not the bricks, but bricks are, let's say that these are humans. Right? So the state, the origin of the state is made by number of humans, but that is the shape, the arcane that keeps all these humans together. So that is the idea. And what Hobbes observed infamously, that international relations is an anarchic structure that prevails. Anarchy in international relations, where the life is nasty, brutish, and short, or nasty, short, and brutish. So the main idea here is that if you do not have this particular structure, which denotes for the Leviathan or the state, that you end up being in an anarchy. And I think that in chapter 13, Hobbes explains the state of nature and anarchy, and the understanding of anarchy, absence of centralized authority, and introduces the very concept of the artificial man, the Leviathan, that is that governing the whole nation for the commonwealth of in Latin, what he calls the civitas. But in the next chapter, in the subsequent chapter, he all of a sudden says that states are like gladiators in an arena, and they would never really would give up their own understanding of authority, and that would be kind of the making international relations is an all-over anarchy. That's the main argument. Now, because the time is so limited, I'm gonna just accelerate a certain thing and then wrap up my argument. Now, of course, we can add more names here. So many different names we can add. Maybe von Clausewitz would be one, as he infamously said that war is a continuum of politics by other means. But I think that the 20th century, E.H. Carr, here just before of the World War II, and Hans Morgenthau after the war would be the two names that we should add for the classical understanding of realist international relations. Is that E.H. Carr, of course, wrote a book titled 20 Years' Crisis, arguing that 20 years here means that the period between 1919, the end of the World War I, and 1939, the beginning of the World War II. This is practically in the 20th century where the modern understanding of international relations started, and World War I, the Great War, gave birth to the understanding, the scientific understanding of international relations. So, and Carr's main argument is that, hey, you had been trying to understand in the so-called first great debate in international relations that idealists wanted to create a better world for the League of Nations and international cooperation, but it ended up with the rise of the fascists in Europe, Stalinism in Russia, and so on and so forth. So the basic argument is that the realities on the ground in world politics or international relations does not really does not really give us too big of a space, due to the fact that it's an anarchic structure, that we cannot really appease these dictators. And then we can also, I think, that connect this idea to the Machiavellian virtue in a way that what would have happened if we stopped Hitler in the early 1930s, early to mid 1930s, when Germany was still not too strong and Hitler was not still able to mobilize perhaps the entire German nation or the Germanic nations. So the argument is that the reality requires us to behave in quote unquote in a cruel way, so that the states, the artificial man, the body politic would survive. That's the basic realist argument. And Morgenthau comes out with the 6 principles of realism. He identifies that the space for morality would be very limited, and the international relations or global politics, his book is titled Politics Among Nations. So it is kind of giving us another understanding. I can even add, kind of extend this linear time and add Kenneth Waltz for another person who gave us the structural understanding of structural realism or neorealism. So this is kind of the well-known identity or idea of international relations in the Western world. Now, let's try to turn the table and ask further questions. The first one is that what really motivated each and every one of these realist, quote-unquote, theorists to contemplate, to come up with these ideas? And I think that the main idea is the experience of war. This is a well-known fact that what gave birth to the scientific inquiry of international relations or the philosophical discussion on global politics, international politics, has always been war. So war is something that is there. Of course, how you approach to war differs. That if you're coming from more idealist or liberal perspective, that war is something that is preventable or something devastatingly bad, that we should come together and stop it, maybe in Kantian ideas, in some other philosophers in the classical period, in the Enlightenment period. A lot of people were trying to stop seeing the war as a disease, the biggest disease, and they would like to maybe perhaps stop the war. The realists, on the other hand, would say that, as I mentioned in von Clausewitz, that war is just a continuum of politics by other means. So war is the reality of global politics. So it's just a real, it's just a fact, like an earthquake or the gravity and so on and so forth. Perhaps even the Waltzian understanding of international relations is very similar to Newtonian physics, where only the mass of the entities would matter, like the billiard balls or planets. That is also another discussion that I would like to postpone for another discussion. But now, at an individual level, what is interesting to me is that all these people had experienced a really great war in their lifetimes. And from psychological or psychoanalytical perspective, I argued elsewhere that they studied this to compensate their trauma. The reality was so harsh in psychoanalytical terms, and French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan would call it the real. The real was so hard that they came up with this theory, this fantasy, what we now call as international relations, to compensate all these horror that they went through. That is one argument that I have already made in my writings. But one last point that I would like to make is that, okay, now you see that this is linear, but there is an eye that is looking to the world. And the very original word theory, which is very similar to the word theater, is all about watching or seeing a stage. So if this is the global stage that the theorist, the eye of the theorist, so to speak, is seeing, and that is the understanding of the Western eye. So the West is watching the world. Now, this can be changed. This eye could be replaced. And this is really interesting to see that, for instance, we juxtapose the domestic politics to international politics by ontologically switching arcane. If there's arcane, if there's authority to rule, the central authority, that it is more or less the domestic politics. In its absence, that is international politics. But if you realize that it is absence and presence of the same concept of arcane, and in the same fashion, when we talk about Western, which is watching the whole entire world stage, and if we try to say non-Western, so it is still Western and the capital is still on the W in phallic image, that is the absence of Western. So there is no signified beyond the West if we compare the West to non-West. And I find this very problematic in our theorizing of international relations, because it is not only too Western, as it has been recently very much so acknowledged, but those who criticize the Western IR theories under the name of non-Western are falling in the same conceptual trap, this way or that way, that they are still not questioning the center of the eye of international relations or IR. And unless we first identify that we all talk about the stage and how realistic that stage has been explained, that is the main, I guess, the epistemological concern, or what exists there, the ontological concern. But what I am saying is that there's also the theorist that has been completely neglected in our theorizing. Unfortunately, at this point, my time is over. In the next lectures, hopefully I'll elaborate what I am trying to say here further. Take care and have a great day.